For almost 30 years, people have asked one question: who killed Tupac Shakur? But that's not exactly the question this jury has to answer, because prosecutors aren't claiming that the man sitting in the courtroom, Duane Keefe D. Davis, actually pulled the trigger. They're saying he helped orchestrate the murder. And here's what makes this case so interesting from an investigative standpoint. Some of the most important evidence against Keefe D came from Keefe D himself, which makes him the dumbest individual breathing in Las Vegas right now. And I'll qualify that later in the video. Now, his defense is essentially saying, don't believe everything he said. So today I want to do something different. I want to separate what Keefe D said happened from what the evidence can actually prove happened. Because after 30 years of documentaries, interviews, books, rumors, podcasts, conspiracy theories, it's easy for these allegations to start sounding like established facts. That's not how we're going to approach this. We're going to look at this the way that investigators should and do look at these things. There are 4 categories I want you to keep in mind throughout this trial. We got confirmed fact, allegation, reasonable inference, and speculation. Those are 4 very different things. And once you start mixing them together, you can make almost any theory sound convincing. Duane Davis has pleaded not guilty. The prosecution has the burden of proving the case beyond a reasonable doubt. So the question isn't whether you've heard a convincing story about Tupac's murder. The question is, what evidence proves Keefe D is criminally responsible for it? So let's go back to September 7th, 1996. Tupac Shakur and Suge Knight were in Las Vegas for the Mike Tyson-Bruce Sheldon fight. After the fight, surveillance video captured Tupac, Knight, and others attacking Orlando Baby Lane Anderson at the MGM. Anderson was Keefe D's nephew. Prosecutors say that confrontation helps explain the motive for what happened next: retaliation. Later that night, Tupac was riding in a black BMW driven by Suge Knight. A white Cadillac pulled alongside them near the Las Vegas Strip. Gunfire erupted. Tupac was struck multiple times. He died 6 days later. Suge Knight survived the attack. Keefe D is not accused of being the person who fired the fatal shots. And you might immediately think, then how can the prosecutors convict him of murder? Because the prosecution's theory is that Davis participated in and helped orchestrate the killing. Prosecutors allege he obtained a gun and was part of the retaliatory attack. The more important question is, can they prove his alleged participation in the murder? And this is where the case gets really interesting. For years, this was one of the most famous unsolved murders in America. Then Keefe D started talking and talking and talking. But before the public interviews and before his book, there was an important law enforcement interview. In 2008, while detectives were investigating the murder of Christopher Wallace, the notorious B.I.G., Davis discussed Tupac's killing. Jurors have now heard that recording, and according to Davis's account, he was inside the white Cadillac. He described passing the gun towards the men in the seat sitting behind him, and he identified his nephew, Orlando Anderson, as the person who ultimately fired at Tupac's vehicle. Now, stop right there. That's a significant statement. If I'm investigating this case and somebody places himself in the vehicle used in the murder and describes what happened to the gun, I'm paying very close attention to that. But I'm not closing my notebook and saying, okay, guess what? Case closed. Because now I've got another job to do. I've got to prove what he's telling me. And there's another complication with that 2008 interview that I despise. During that interview, investigators told Davis the conversation that they had was confidential, and what he said that day couldn't be used against him. Now, prosecutors contend that Davis later went to the public with the story himself in interviews, podcasts, and memoir, and that those later actions affected the protections he claimed. There's been a legal fight over this, and that's what this is all about. There's been a legal fight over those statements. But from an investigative standpoint, I think there's an even more important question. If I'm investigating this case, I'm not stopping because a suspect tells me, here's what happened. That's where the work actually starts. Because now I want to know, what can I corroborate? And I want you to remember that word corroborate, because that's what I'm watching throughout this trial. I want to know what evidence exists independent of Keefe D that confirms what Keefe D said. Let's take this story apart piece by piece. First, was Keefe D actually inside that Cadillac? He said he was. Okay. What else establishes it? Do we have any witnesses? Do we have any contemporaneous statements? Do we have physical evidence? Do we have any type of documentation? Someone else placing them in that vehicle? That's how you test that statement. And prosecutors have another challenge on their hands. 3 other alleged occupants of that vehicle are all dead. Now think about what that means for a case being tried almost 30 years later. Those are 3 people who cannot talk, walk into that courtroom, give an oath, and tell the jury what happened inside that car. So prosecutors have to reconstruct that part of the story through whatever evidence still exists. The second part is Davis has described supplying or passing the firearm. If the jury believes that account, that's potentially powerful evidence. But again, don't stop there. Ask the next question. What corroborates it? The gun used to kill Tupac was never recovered, according to current reporting. So prosecutors don't have the alleged murder weapon sitting in the courtroom where they could still simply point to forensic evidence and say, here's the gun, and here's how it's connected to Davis. That doesn't mean that this account is false, though. It means that one obvious avenue of physical corroboration isn't available. Prosecutors say that this was retaliation for what happened at the MGM Grand. Here they have something concrete. Video. We can actually see the earlier confrontation. We don't have to rely on somebody remembering it 30 years later. The confrontation happened. It's on video. Now, prosecutors can argue that the confrontation helped establish motive for what happened afterward, but here's where we have to have a little tad of discipline. Evidence of motive is not automatically evidence proving participation. Those aren't the same thing. The MGM video can help answer why might somebody have wanted to retaliate. It doesn't automatically answer who participated in the murder. That's a separate question requiring a separate bit of evidence. And this brings us to the defense, because their position creates one of the strangest dynamic in this whole case. Their client has made incriminating statements, and now the defense has to convince jurors that those statements aren't as reliable as the prosecution say they are. Think about that for a second. Usually, Hill Nation, we're accustomed to prosecutors standing in front of a jury saying, don't believe the defendant. Here, the prosecutors are using the defendant's own words against him. And the defense is saying, you can't simply accept everything this man has said over the years as the truth. He told stories. He exaggerated. And the prosecutors still have to prove the case. That's the unusual position. But it's not necessarily an impossible one, because people do lie, people exaggerate, people brag, people change stories. And sometimes people even say things that hurt themselves. That's why an investigator doesn't simply decide he said it, so it must be true. You test a statement against everything else you know. But let me change to the other side too, because I don't want us making the opposite mistake. We can't simply say that Keefe D talked a lot, therefore his statements aren't reliable. His statements are evidence, have no illusions. And prosecutors can make a serious argument here. This wasn't necessarily one random statement made once. They can point jurors towards statements Davis made to authorities later in interviews and in his memoirs. They can compare those accounts against facts that can be established independently. And that's where corroboration becomes powerful. Let's say somebody tells investigators 10 things about a crime. If investigators independently verify one detail, maybe that doesn't tell you much. But what happens if they verify 5? How about 7? What about 9? And especially if some of those details weren't widely known. Now the analysis begins to change, because every independently verified detail potentially strengthens the credibility of other parts of the account. That's why I wouldn't frame this as, is there evidence besides Keefe D? I'd ask something much more precise, and that would be, how much of Keefe D's story can prosecutors independently corroborate? That's the question. And prosecutors are dealing with another enormous obstacle too. Naturally, 30 years later, anybody who's worked investigation understands what time can do to a case. Witnesses die, memories fade. People who once wanted to talk may no longer want to have anything to do with the case. Evidence can disappear. Records become harder to locate. Investigative opportunities that existed in 1996 it simply doesn't exist anymore. And we've already seen some of that difficulty surrounding this case. Some witnesses have been reluctant to revisit events that happened 3 decades ago. There has also been testimony describing how difficult it was to get people to cooperate even back then. So imagine trying to go ahead and reconstruct those conversations and relationships almost 30 years later. That's why I want to be very careful when I hear somebody say 30 years later, they finally solved the Tupac's murder. Maybe prosecutors can prove their case. Maybe they can't. That's what this trial's for. But filing charges is not the same thing as proving a case. An indictment isn't a conviction. Suspicion by itself isn't proof. Suspicion isn't proof. And a compelling story isn't automatically proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The evidence still has to survive the courtroom. There's another issue jurors may have to wrestle with. Davis hasn't always told exactly the same story. Trial testimony has highlighted earlier statements in which he denied his nephew's involvement or offered different theories about what happened. Later, he gave an account implicating himself and identifying Orlando Anderson as the shooter. Now, both sides can do something with that. The defense can say, there you go, this man changes his story. How can you rely on him? But prosecutors can respond and say, look at when each statement was made. Look at why it was made. Look at Davis. Look at what he's trying to accomplish. Then compare each version against evidence that could be independently established. That's how investigators evaluate changing statements. You don't simply count inconsistencies. You try to understand them. Why did the story change? What changed? Was the person protecting somebody? Was he exaggerating? Was he minimizing? Was he trying to impress somebody? Or was he finally telling the truth? Those are all questions, but they're not conclusions. And that's the important distinction. This is exactly why you don't evaluate a statement in isolation. You test it. You test the statement against the timeline. You test it against physical evidence. You test it against witnesses. You test it against prior statements. And then you ask, what survives? What is corroborated? What is contradicted? And what still depends entirely on the word of the person telling the story? There's another fascinating part of this case. After almost 30 years, this trial still may not definitively answer the question the public cares about most. Who actually pulled the trigger? Davis identified Orlando Anderson, but other accounts have pointed elsewhere. And Anderson died in 1998. Here's where the courtroom and the public curiosity can go into 2 different directions. The public wants every mystery solved. Who fired, who planned it, who knew, who ordered what, who was sitting where, who said what thereafter. A criminal trial doesn't necessarily have to answer every historical question surrounding Tupac Shakur's death. The jury has a much narrower responsibility. Did the state prove the charges against Keefe D beyond a reasonable doubt? That's their job. So here's where I am right now. We know Tupac Shakur and others were involved in an attack on Orlando Anderson at the MGM Grand, right? Hours later, Tupac was shot from another vehicle and ultimately died. Davis has made statements describing his own presence and involvement. Those statements are now an important part of the prosecution's case. The prosecutors allege Davis helped organize and facilitate a retaliatory murder. His lawyers challenged those incriminating counts and argue that the prosecutor cannot sufficiently corroborate them. And the ultimate question, whether prosecutors have proven Davis criminally responsible beyond a reasonable doubt, belongs to the jury. We're not there yet. So as the trial continues, here's what I'm watching. Every time prosecutors introduce another piece of evidence, I'm asking, does this independently corroborate something that Keefe D said? If it does, that portion of the count gets stronger. If evidence contradicts him, acknowledge that too, right? And if we get to a particular allegation and the only evidence supporting it is Keefe D saying, that's what happened, then we need to identify it for exactly what it is. Not dismiss it and not exaggerate it. Just put it in the correct evidentiary box. That's how I think we should evaluate this case without getting swallowed by 30 years of rumors, some documentaries, celebrity names, interviews, and conspiracy theories. We're not trying to decide which story sounds the best. We're trying to determine which parts of the story the evidence can actually support. And here's the question I want to leave you with. Suppose you're sitting on that jury. A defendant has repeatedly described his own involvement in a murder. Now, his attorneys are telling you those accounts aren't reliable enough to convict him. What would you need to see? How much independent corroboration would you need before you're willing to say, I'm convinced beyond a reasonable doubt? And just don't tell me in the comments below, guilty or not guilty. Tell me what evidence gets you there. What would you need from the prosecutors? What would create reasonable doubt for you? That's the discussion I want to have. You challenge, I defend, the evidence decides.
This is the hill of justice.